The name on my driver's license is Brandon White. I was 32 years old on the afternoon of July 14th, 2024, when the world as I knew it simply stopped making sense. I remember the heat in Dallas that day. It was the kind of oppressive, humid weight that makes the asphalt feel soft under your boots. I was standing in a local hardware store, staring at a wall of galvanized nails, trying to remember if I needed the 3-inch or the 2.5. It's funny how the brain clings to the mundane right before it breaks. There was no flash of light, no cinematic premonition, just a sudden, sharp metallic taste at the back of my tongue, followed by a sensation like my internal thermostat had been ripped out. I reached for the shelf to steady myself, but my hand didn't seem to belong to me anymore. My vision began to tunnel, the bright fluorescent lights overhead swirling into a single, blinding white. I felt my knees hit the linoleum, a dull thud that sounded like it was happening in another room. A woman in a floral print dress dropped her handbasket nearby. I remember the sound of a glass jar of pickles shattering. The smell of vinegar filled the air, sharp and acidic. I tried to speak, to tell her I was fine, but my jaw was locked. This wasn't a fainting spell. This was a total system failure. My heart wasn't beating. It was vibrating, a frantic, useless flutter in my chest that the doctors would later call ventricular fibrillation. As I slumped against a display of power drills, the world turned into a low-resolution photograph, then a gray mist, then nothing at all. I wasn't scared yet. I was just profoundly confused that my life was ending next to a 20% off sign for cordless impact wrenches. The transition from the hardware store floor to the emergency room at Baylor University Medical Center felt like a jump cut in a film. One moment, I was in the vinegar-soaked silence of the aisle, and the next, I was hovering near the ceiling of Trauma Room 4. The transition was devoid of tunnel light or angelic choirs. It was sterile, frantic, and terrifyingly grounded. I watched from about 8 feet up as a team of 6 people hovered over a pale, sweat-soaked version of myself. I saw the lead attending physician, a man with graying hair and a name tag that read Dr. Aris, shouting orders while a nurse frantically cut through my favorite denim jacket with heavy-duty shears. I felt a strange pang of annoyance seeing that jacket ruined. It was a vintage find from a shop in Austin. The realism of death is much colder than the movies suggest. I watched them place the defibrillator paddles on my chest. I saw my own body jerk violently upward, a grotesque puppet reaction to the 200 joules of electricity surging through my stagnant heart. Clear. Dr. Aris barked again. Thump. My body settled back onto the thin mattress, unresponsive. I could see the cardiac monitor from my vantage point, a flat, unwavering green line that mocked the frantic energy of the room. I noticed the small details. The way the nurse's mask was slipping off her nose, the beads of sweat on the technician's forehead, the smear of my own blood on the floor where they'd inserted the central line. I wasn't a soul in transit. I was a witness to a failed repair job. I heard the clock ticking on the wall, a rhythmic reminder that my brain was being starved of oxygen with every passing second. There was no peace here, only the clinical, desperate effort to drag a piece of meat back into the land of the living. I looked at my hands. They were translucent, shimmering like heat haze off a summer road. I realized then that the man on the table wasn't me anymore. He was just the vessel I had finished using. The hospital room didn't fade away. It was simply overwritten. One second I was looking at the jagged line of a broken heart monitor, and the next, the sterile white walls had dissolved into a vast, heavy twilight. I wasn't in a garden or a golden city. I was standing on what felt like a high, open plateau at dusk. The air didn't move, but it felt thick, like walking through water. That's when I saw him. He wasn't glowing with a blinding, featureless light. He looked like a man, yet he carried the density of an entire galaxy. He was wearing a dark, simple tunic, and his face held a level of recognition that made my entire life feel like a shallow conversation I'd been having with myself. He didn't say, "Welcome home." He looked at me with a gravity that pulled the breath right out of my spirit. I felt my knees give way, not out of a rehearsed religious habit, but because the sheer reality of his existence made my own history feel like a thin vapor. "Brandon," he said. His voice wasn't a thunderclap. It was a vibration that started in my chest and echoed out toward the horizon. "You are looking for the exit, but but you haven't finished the entry." I looked down at my hands, and for the first time, I saw the shimmering reflected in his eyes. I wanted to ask about heaven, about my grandmother, about the pearly gates I'd heard about in Sunday school since I was 5. But those questions felt like asking for a glass of water while standing in the middle of the ocean. He stepped closer, and the environment shifted. The twilight deepened into a bruised purple, and suddenly, I wasn't just looking at him. I was seeing through his perspective. I saw the world I had just left, but it looked different. It looked like a house with its foundation cracking in slow motion. There was an urgency in his posture, a tension in the way he held his hands. This wasn't a peaceful retirement from reality. This was a briefing. He wasn't there to comfort me. He was there to deputize me. The warmth I expected was replaced by a heavy, sobering responsibility that felt like lead in my veins. He placed a hand on my shoulder, and the plateau vanished. We were standing in the back of a church, a large, modern one with stadium seating and professional lighting. I recognized it. It was a place I'd visited for a conference a year prior. The music was swelling, the smoke machines were humming, and thousands of people had their hands raised in what looked like total devotion. "Watch," Jesus whispered. As I looked, the light I thought I saw coming from the stage began to peel away like cheap wallpaper. Underneath the emotional high, I saw a sea of gray. I saw people weeping, not out of repentance, but out of a desperate, addictive need to feel something. Anything. That wasn't their own emptiness. I saw the pastor on stage, and instead of a heart for the flock, his chest contained a complex machine of ego and metric tracking. He was calculating the engagement of the crowd while he spoke about the Holy Spirit. "The first truth, Brandon," he said, his voice flat and grieving, "is that the church has traded my presence for an atmosphere. They have built golden calves out of experiences and called it worship." I watched as a woman in the front row collapsed, sobbing, but as her heart was laid bare to me, I realized she wasn't seeking God. She was seeking a bypass for her own refusal to forgive her sister. She wanted a chemical hit of grace without the surgery of change. Jesus didn't look angry. He looked exhausted, like a father watching his children play with a live wire they thought was a toy. "They are shouting my name into a void they created themselves," he told me. "They believe the louder the music, the closer I am, but I am standing at the door, and no one is looking at the handle." The realization hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. We've been curated, not converted. We've turned the creator of the universe into a lifestyle brand, and we are dying of thirst while standing in a choreographed rainstorm. He turned to me, his eyes boring into mine. "When you go back, you will see the stage for what it is, a wooden box. And you will see the people for what they are, starving captives who think they are at a banquet." The church sanctuary didn't fade, it fractured. The walls pulled apart like wet paper, revealing the skeletal remains of what looked like a massive, rusted clockwork machine. Jesus didn't move, but the environment around us shifted into a space that felt like a cold, sterile office building, the kind with endless cubicles and flickering fluorescent lights that hummed at a frequency that made my teeth ache. We were standing in the middle of a busy sidewalk in downtown Dallas, but everyone was translucent. I could see the internal wiring of their anxieties. This was the economy of silence, he told me. The second truth was a weight that felt like it was crushing my ribs. We have traded our souls for a digital noise that serves no master but the void. I watched a man walking toward us, his eyes glued to a glowing screen, his thumb scrolling with a mechanical, rhythmic twitch. Behind him, a shadow trailed, a dark, viscous tether that pulled tighter with every swipe. "The world is not ending with a bang, Brandon," he said, his voice sounding like shifting gravel. "It is ending with a whisper that no one can hear because they have forgotten how to be still." He showed me a mother sitting at a kitchen table across from her teenage daughter. They were 3 feet apart, but in the spirit, they were separated by a canyon of static. The mother was composing a post about family blessings, while her daughter was staring at a photo of a girl she didn't know, feeling a deep, poisonous envy that was physically eroding her heart. Jesus reached out and touched the air between them, and I saw the static turn into a swarm of black flies. "The second truth is that you are being harvested," he said. "Your attention is the currency of the enemy, and you are giving it away for free. You believe you are connected, but you are merely being cataloged. I felt a wave of nausea. I thought of my own phone, sitting in the pocket of my ruined denim jacket back in the ER. I thought of the hours I'd spent scrolling through nothingness, a slow-motion suicide of the mind. He looked at me, and I saw the reflection of a billion screens in his eyes, a flickering, chaotic light that offered no warmth. "They are building a kingdom of glass," he whispered, "and they are surprised when it shatters at the first sign of heat." The scene shifted violently. I wasn't on a sidewalk anymore. I was in my own living room. The air smelled of the sandalwood candle my wife, Sarah, always lit when she was stressed. It was 3 weeks into the future. I knew this because the calendar on the wall was marked August 2024. I saw myself sitting on the sofa, looking physically recovered but spiritually hollow. Sarah was standing by the window, her back to me. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like a physical barrier. I watched as the future version of myself tried to speak, to tell her about the hospital, about the light, about the machine. But the words died in my throat. I saw the fracture in our marriage, a hairline crack that I had ignored for years, suddenly widening into a chasm. "This is the warning, Brandon," Jesus said, standing beside the bookshelf where I kept my old college journals. "The truth will cost you the comfort of your lies." I watched Sarah turn around. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she held a phone in her hand, my phone. She had found the messages, not of an affair, but of a secret life of financial desperation and small, corrosive deceits I'd woven to keep up the appearance of being the successful Christian man. I saw the moment her trust in me didn't just break, it evaporated. "The third truth is the most uncomfortable," he continued, his hand resting on the back of my future self's neck. "You cannot carry the weight of my glory while you are still clinging to the anchor of your ego." I watched my future self put his head in his hands and weep, a dry, racking sob that had no bottom. The man of faith I portrayed at church was a mask, and the mask was being melted off by the sheer proximity of the divine. I felt a cold dread wash over me. This wasn't a vision of a global apocalypse. It was the apocalypse of my private world. "You will lose the house," he said plainly, without a hint of pity. "You will lose the reputation. You will lose the silence that protected your secrets. This is the price of returning." The room began to spin, the sandalwood scent turning into the smell of ozone and hospital antiseptic. The personal threat was clear. I wasn't going back to a hero's welcome. I was going back to a reckoning. The walls of my living room didn't just dissolve. They peeled back like sun-scorched skin to reveal a landscape that looked like a digital blueprint of every soul on earth. Jesus wasn't standing beside me anymore. He was standing ahead of me, silhouetted against a horizon that looked like a burning sunrise. "The final truth, Brandon, is the one they will hate you for," he said, and the air around us vibrated with a low, mournful hum. "They believe that the end is a date on a calendar, a 2026 or a 2030. They are wrong. The end is a series of no's that they have whispered in the dark." He pointed toward a shimmering grid beneath our feet. I saw a map of my own neighborhood, but instead of houses, I saw glowing nodes of light. Some were vibrant and gold, others were flickering, dying embers. "The third truth is that the separation has already happened," he explained, his voice devoid of the comforting cadence I'd heard in 1,000 sermons. "People think they are waiting for a judgment day, but they are living in the middle of it right now. Every time they choose the image over the reality, the comfort over the cross, or the safety of the tribe over the weight of the truth, they are marking their own foreheads." I saw a man I recognized, a deacon from my church, sitting in his car, screaming at his wife through a speakerphone while his dashboard glowed with a "Support the Church" sticker. The light in his chest was a dull, muddy brown. "This is what determines the outcome," Jesus said, his eyes like two steady flames. "It isn't about the prayers you say in public. It's about the appetite of your soul when no one is watching. The world is being sifted, Brandon, not by me, but by its own desires. I am simply the light that makes the shadows visible." The realization was terrifying. It wasn't a cosmic war of swords and shields. It was a quiet, internal rot that was reaching its terminal phase. The uncomfortable truth was that God wasn't going to save us from our choices. He was going to grant them to us in full. We were suddenly back in the hospital, but time had stopped. The doctors were frozen in mid-motion. Dr. Aris had his hand on the defibrillator dial, his face contorted in a silent shout. The nurse was suspended in the air, a syringe of epinephrine inches from my lifeless arm. Jesus walked over to the table where my body lay. He looked down at the pale, bruised version of Brandon White with a look of profound, heavy sorrow. He looked at me, the spirit version of me, and for the first time, his gaze felt like a physical weight that I couldn't bear. "You asked why I showed you this," he said. "You think you are special because you are seeing the behind the scenes. You aren't. You are just a man who was allowed to see the bill before it was due." He grabbed my translucent arm, and the sensation was like being plunged into ice water. "Why 2026? I managed to stammer, my voice sounding like cracking glass. "Why does the title of my life say the end is near?" He leaned in, his face inches from mine. "Because by then, the silence will be gone. The systems you trust, your banks, your buildings, your digital altars, will begin to speak their true names. They will demand a worship you cannot give and still remain mine. You saw the fracture in your home, Brandon. Multiply that by every household on this planet. The warning isn't about a fire from the sky. It's about the fire in the human heart that has been stoked by a century of lies." He didn't offer a hug or a platitude. He offered a choice. "You can stay here in the quiet, or you can go back and be the man who tells them the banquet is poisoned. They will call you a madman. They will call you a traitor to the faith they've built. Your wife will look at you like a stranger because you will no longer be able to play the game." He let go of my arm, and the frozen room began to jitter, like a film reel catching on a hot bulb. "Go back," he commanded, "and tell them that the door is closing, not because I am locking it, but because they have forgotten it's there." The transition wasn't a peaceful drift back into a waiting vessel. It was a physical assault. It felt like being shoved through a keyhole while made of jagged glass. The silence of the plateau was shattered by the rhythmic, mechanical shriek of a heart monitor that had found a pulse. I felt my lungs expand for the first time in what the records would later say was nearly 4 minutes. It wasn't a breath of life. It was a searing, burning intake of air that tasted like ozone and dried blood. My ribs screamed from the CPR, a deep, grinding ache that informed me 2 of them were definitely cracked. I tried to open my eyes, but the fluorescent lights of trauma room were needles of white fire. I heard Dr. Aris exhale a breath he'd been holding. "He's back. Rhythm is sinus. Weak, but it's there. Get the lidocaine now." I wanted to tell them to stop. I wanted to tell them that the man they were saving was already mourning the life he was returning to. As the medical team swarmed me, checking my pupils and adjusting my 4 lines, the memory of the 3 truths felt like a heavy stone sitting in my stomach. I looked at the nurse, the one whose mask had been slipping, and for a split second, I didn't see a medical professional. I saw the gray static Jesus had shown me. I saw the flickering node of her soul, struggling to stay lit against a tide of exhaustion and a digital tether that was already vibrating in her pocket. She looked at me, her eyes widening as I gripped her wrist with a strength I shouldn't have had. "The machines," I croaked, my voice a ruined rasp. "They're lying to you." She pulled back, a flash of genuine fear crossing her face before she masked it with clinical professionalism. "He's disoriented," she whispered to the doctor. They didn't understand. I wasn't confused. I was finally, for the first time in 32 years, seeing the room for what it was. A high-tech waiting room for a world that was already halfway through the exit. 2 days later, I was sitting in a recovery bed, the smell of hospital Salisbury steak and lemon-scented floor cleaner clinging to everything. My phone, the black mirror I had seen in the vision, was sitting on the plastic rolling tray next to my water pitcher. My hand trembled as I reached for it. I remembered the second truth, the economy of silence. I remembered the warning about the golden calf of our digital lives. I opened my banking app, expecting to see the meager 3-figure balance I'd been hiding from Sarah. Instead, the screen flickered, a glitchy green line cutting through the interface before it stabilized. The numbers were there, but next to the balance was a new notification, a social stability grade that I had never seen before. It was a small, gray icon that looked like a locked gate. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. I clicked it, and a message appeared. Account access restricted due to behavioral volatility detected in medical records. I hadn't even been discharged yet, and the machine had already cataloged my near-death experience as a liability. This was the subtle, irreversible event I had been warned about. My heart rate began to climb, the monitor at my bedside chirping in protest. I looked at the date on the top of the screen, July 16, 2024. Then, I saw a promoted news headline at the bottom of the app, a future outlook piece, preparing for the 2026 Unified Digital Ledger. Why privacy is the new public risk. The air in the room suddenly felt as thick as it had on the plateau. I realized that the uncomfortable truths weren't just spiritual metaphors. They were the blueprints for a cage that was being built around us in real time. I looked at my reflection in the dark screen of the phone. I looked like a ghost. I tried to call Sarah, but the call wouldn't go through. A small prompt appeared. Voice communication limited until identity re-verification is completed at a local administrative hub. I dropped the phone on the bed. The weight of the warning wasn't a roar. It was the sound of 1,000 tiny locks clicking into place simultaneously. I was back in my body, but the world I had returned to was already beginning to speak its true name. I was discharged 3 days later into a world that looked exactly the same, but felt fundamentally wrong. The Dallas skyline was shimmering in the heat, the glass towers reflecting a sky so blue it looked artificial. When Sarah picked me up, she didn't hug me. She kept her hands on the steering wheel of the SUV, her knuckles white. She didn't ask about the other side. She asked why the hospital billing department had called her to say our primary insurance had been recategorized. I sat in the passenger seat, my cracked ribs aching with every turn, and realized I couldn't tell her the truth yet. I couldn't tell her that her husband had died and come back as a whistleblower for a kingdom she didn't believe was under siege. That Sunday, I forced myself to go to church. I needed to see if the first truth held up under the weight of reality. As I walked into the sanctuary, the bass from the worship band was so loud it made the surgical staples in my chest throb. I stood in the third row, watching the pastor, the same man from my vision, walk onto the stage under a spotlight that cost more than most people's cars. He started talking about the great reset of faith and digital stewardship. He was using the same words Jesus had used, but he was twisting them into a call for compliance. In 2026, he shouted, his face projected 40 feet high on the LED screens. We will finally have the tools to ensure every member of this flock is accounted for. No one lost. No one left behind in the old systems. The crowd cheered. I stood there, frozen, as I saw the gray static from my vision beginning to bleed through the room. I saw the people around me, friends I'd known for a decade, raising their hands not to God, but to the promise of a curated safety. I realized then that the church I loved had already been hollowed out from the inside. They weren't waiting for a savior. They were waiting for an upgrade. I walked out during the closing prayer, the smell of the smoke machine sticking to my clothes like the scent of an approaching fire. It happened on March 18, 2026, today. I am sitting in a small, rented apartment on the outskirts of the city. Sarah is gone. She left 6 months ago when I refused to sign the Unified Digital Ledger that our church and bank required for verified fellowship. The personal fracture Jesus showed me wasn't a metaphor. It was a slow, agonizing divorce from everything I once considered my identity. My phone, the one I used to record this, is a ghost device running on a partition network I have to pay for in cash. The third truth is no longer a warning. It is my daily bread. The world has shifted into the high-frequency vibration I felt on that plateau, a buzzing tension that makes it hard to sleep. The proof, the one thing I can never take back, is sitting on my kitchen table. It's a physical letter from the Department of Social Coordination, hand-delivered because my digital footprint has been deprioritized. It informs me that because of my behavioral non-compliance and refusal of the 2026 Identity Protocol, my right to public assembly has been revoked. But that isn't the part that haunts me. It's the small, thermal-printed receipt tucked inside the envelope. It's a list of every prayer I've whispered into my phone's microphone over the last 2 years, flagged as subversive theological sentiment. They weren't just watching my bank account, they were indexing my soul. I look out the window at the twilight sky, the same bruised purple I saw when I stood before him. A neighbor is walking his dog, his wrist glowing with the faint blue light of the new protocol band. He looks up and catches my eye, then quickly looks away, his pace quickening. The silence between us isn't empty, it's a wall. I remember his final words. The door is closing, not because I am locking it, but because they have forgotten it's there. I pick up a small, smooth stone I found in the hardware store parking lot the day I died. It's cold and heavy in my palm. The world is moving on, synchronized and silent, and I am just a man standing in the dark, holding a piece of the foundation that everyone else decided to leave behind. If this message felt important, it probably was. There are more stories like this, and they only get deeper. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next one, because some warnings aren't meant to be ignored.